Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Podcast powered by First National. I am Adam Pawadic here with Aaron Cameron. This is part of the Winnipeg Real Estate Forum video speaker series. We've got a very interesting guest lined up today. It's Jim Trainor, Senior VP, Aon Commercial Risk Solutions. He's not I guess, direct real estate practitioner. Is that a fair statement, Jim? But knowledgeable in an area that we should probably pay more attention to, and we'll be doing more so in the future. Jim had a background with the FBI in a cybercrime department, and he's now taken this skill set over to Aon, specifically as far as listeners care today, how they can protect their buildings from that increasing risk. Jim, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So are we safe to even talk on this connection? Let's start with our first security risks here. We're okay to speak? Is this
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have to communicate one way or the other. So, I'm sure we're fine.
Okay, perfect. Maybe before we jump into cyber threats to real estate, let's get into your background, how you got to where you are today. It sounds like you've had a few versions of a career under the heading of cybercrime.
Yeah. Well, so if we go way back after graduating college, I went into the military. So I was an intel officer in the U.S. Army, many, many years ago, and then after 4 years, decided to get out and went back to graduate school, and then was fortunate to enter into the FBI as a new agent back in 1996. So I served 20 years in the FBI in multiple field offices. I started off in Chicago, and headquarters in DC, New Haven, Boston, New York City, and then my final assignment was in Washington, D.C., head of the cyber division, which is one of 4 operational divisions in the FBI. So if you put it in business context, there are really kind of like 4 lines of business: counterterrorism, counterintelligence, criminal, and cyber. So I was the senior leader for the FBI in that cyber line of business, which is the division that does computer intrusion investigations. So all these data breaches that you hear about in the US and certainly in Canada and across the globe, the Bureau, along with our international partners, are the ones that are looking to identify the individual and the groups that are responsible for these data breaches. So after 20 years of service, I retired and came on board with Aon in 2016.
Over the 20 years, how big did that department grow? Because you were not inception of the internet or anything like that, but definitely early days in terms of the growth of the internet in our lives. I imagine that the head count in that department would have been multiples more by the end.
Yeah, so the cyber division was established in 2002. So it's one of the newer organizations, newer the divisions within the bureau. FBI was established in 1908. So it's the smaller of those 4 big divisions that are doing investigations and operations. So when I went back to DC in 2013, I should even back up a little bit. So when the Bureau's Director Mueller at the time really wanted to establish cyber, because he knew that the crime would be, and espionage and terrorism would certainly be enabled by the growth of the internet and connectivity. 9/11 certainly changed that with that kind of event. Most of his focus was really changing the organization from becoming more of an intelligence-led organization, specifically focused on counterterrorism matters. So historically, early days, the Bureau was focusing a lot on crimes against children and things of that nature. And then around 2010 or so, it really shifted into really focusing on computer intrusion investigations. So the division grew dramatically. There are 56 field offices within the FBI. So those are the offices that conduct the investigations: Chicago, New Haven, Boston, New York, LA, things like that. And then Washington, D.C. is where the cyber division is located, and that's the division that oversees all of those investigations. And then there are also legal attaches or assistant legal attaches. We have, during my time frame, we deployed several agents overseas at the embassies. So there's an FBI agent in Ottawa that works with Canadian authorities, whether it's the Canadian Mounted Police or CSIS, to work collaboratively on those investigations, and particularly if infrastructure in Canada is being used to attack the U.S. or vice versa. So there's a lot of intelligence sharing as in all of these investigations. Most of the bad actors that are involved in this stuff don't reside in the U.S., don't reside in Canada. they're somewhere else in the world, and we have to work together to interrupt them. But I don't want to necessarily go into the numbers, but it's north of 1,000. I'll just say that in terms of the cyber division, headquarters agents, computer scientists, analysts.
I don't know why, but I keep feeling like it's. I want to say it's like catching a falling knife, and I know that's not the perfect analogy, but the evolution, the change, and the speed at which there is change, or the ability, because the internet sort of, to a certain degree, kind of undefined and in many ways kind of without restriction or law, or not terribly regulated. It's kind of rife for flexibility and creativity for the bad actors to kind of find ways to take advantage or commit whatever fraud or crime that they're trying to commit. To be in charge or to be working on the other side to try to come up with the ways, like maybe just describe what that process is like, because it's different than, I think, at least my very layman sense is that it's different than sort of like organized crime, like drug trafficking, etc., where there's a little bit more restrictions on the ways that they can kind of circumvent the law.
Yeah, I mean, good question. And essentially, the way I would kind of define that is really there are a lot of drivers of increased risk. So, there are more and more connected devices now. The data size never gets smaller. With the advent of various cryptocurrencies, the ability to really extract a ransom, say in a ransomware attack where data is encrypted and you can't get access to your data unless you pay a ransom. AI is a particular area which we'll see really both for the benefit and for for the worse as it relates to cybersecurity companies certainly utilizing AI to identify additional how malware can transverse through the network and the vulnerabilities associated with it, and that certainly allows for scale as well. Um, but in terms of the skill set and the types of groups, there are a variety of way to categorize them. I would probably put them in five different groups. You have your criminal actors, you have your nation state actors. The nation state ones: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, being the four principal countries that engage in a lot of these computer intrusions against Western countries such as Canada and U.S. And then you have hacktivists, where these kinds of kids do things for their own really kind of malicious purposes. And then you have terrorist organizations that, in general, aren't active in this space. They're a much smaller fraction of the cases that the Bureau would look at or the Canadians would look at. And then the last, you have insiders, and we have insiders in any organization where they go rogue, and all of a sudden you have data theft, and then obviously significant risk to organizations. So those are the groups. The speed at which these cases with these computer intrusions happens is at the speed of light. The ability for government to respond is really at the speed of the legal process. So in that context, it moves much slower. But what government is really doing is looking for mistakes that these bad actors make, and identify that information, and then subsequently with a term called attribution, which is really the term who's responsible for the event, and then figuring out what's the next logical step that you could take to either disrupt their infrastructure or potentially do an arrest, law operation, sanctions, a whole range of things.
Of the list that you rhymed off there of potential bad actors, which ones should real estate owners be most concerned about?
Primarily the criminal ones, for sure. So, the vast majority of computer intrusion cases that the FBI would look at are criminal actors, and it's specifically related to ransomware. So they're really, and there's also, I would also say, business email compromise, which is a kind of a social engineering attack. So real estate industry, the data that they have is certainly important to them, but it's not really important to a nation state actor, right? Russia, the SVR, GRU, FSB, they're really not interested in that industry. Um, but criminal actors very well would be, and that's where the real estate industry potentially could be vulnerable. It's not their core business, cybersecurity, right? They're in the business of providing commercial real estate, multifamily, whatever the setting is, and that's the challenge where you have an industry that doesn't have, it may or may not have been heavily invested in cybersecurity, but as I referenced earlier when we were speaking, with buildings becoming more technology enabled, particularly with the operational technology products, locks, alarms, cameras, HVAC systems, elevators, all of the, and then, high-speed internet connectivity, broadband, all of those things with multiple different vendors coming into a building, terms of service, conditions, responsibilities, where does that, the real estate owner, where do the responsibilities lie with the real estate owner versus the vendor, and whether or not even they have cyber insurance is a whole nother conversation. It's going to become challenging. So the one major takeaway that I would leave for your audience is that the cyber threat landscape always evolves. So, and this is all about return on investment. So I'll use ransomware as a perfect example. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, most of the ransomware attacks were really targeting individuals, going after an individual's laptop and encrypting the device and then extracting a ransom in the hundreds of dollars, typically paid by PayPal or credit card. Well, that certainly, is to a degree lucrative for a criminal actor, but why would I go after one computer, one individual? When I can go after organizations and extract, millions of dollars of ransom, tens of millions of dollars of ransom, particularly on scale. And also, there's these ransomware groups where the principal ransomware actor will put together a whole toolkit, a set of tools, whether it's a botnet, the ransomware, the C2 infrastructure, the whole range of tools that you would need to launch an attack, and then sell it on the dark web in the various criminal forums. And then unskilled people can use those tools and just pay a commission back to the developer who really created this ransomware as a service group. And that tends to be, if you're going to conduct these activities, you keep 90% of the ransom and then just give the owner of the ransomware toolkit 10% commission. So it's quite lucrative. And that's, if the real estate industry is not being targeted now, at some point the bad actors will figure out that they very well could be vulnerable and as such be more targeted in the future. What if I just shut down the elevator system, or the fire suppressing system, those types of things. It shuts down the building, and that obviously impacts your tenants and impacts the value of the real estate too, and all that stuff. So it becomes messy business.
It's the Internet of Things and the risk that all that connectivity. We've had a guest on 6 years ago now, and I will not remember his name, who was talking about the impact of blockchain technology in real estate.
Abhishek Sinha.
Look at that. Wow. I'm going to pretend you just came up with that off the top of your head. Yeah. And one of the things he was talking about, this is 6 years ago now, is how the blockchain technology could be used as a security protection with the Internet of Things to prevent hacking and cyber infiltration. Is that something that you've come across, or does that seem outworldly now?
No, there's a lot of innovation out there in this space in terms of protecting organizations. I help a smaller startup in this space that's really trying to do more protection in the OT environment. So historically, a lot of the cybersecurity tools have been about information technology, the IT side, and there are some OT, but OT equipment tends to be a little bit more legacy, meaning older equipment. Security is not built into it. Historically hasn't been targeted as much. That could certainly change. So, and it varies dramatically from one industry to the next, whether it's real estate, energy, manufacturing. The OT environment can be rather complex. So it's certainly, I would argue, kind of the least mature area of cybersecurity. So companies that are, whether it's using blockchain or AI or other, software tools to get greater visibility into your connectivity in your building. So if you have greater visibility, then you can know what is potentially vulnerable or not, and then bring in additional tools to really secure the environment.
The idea of an arms race between bad actors and those who want to protect themselves, it can't be in perfect stasis all the time. I imagine at some point one side or the other must have a an edge over the other. Where do we stand right now in the arms race of trying to protect ourselves, and then where does real estate compare to other areas of enterprise in terms of investing and protecting themselves?
So it's a healthy battle. One could argue that the bad guys are winning this battle. As an example, ransomware payments in 2022 to 2023 went up about a $500 million. So a company called Chain Analysis did some research on where all the ransomware payments went to, over the various um, crypto wallets, because the blockchain is public, so it's visible. And 100% return is quite significant over 1 year. So $1 billion in lost revenue basically, right, over payments.
Is
So the
that
bad guys.
because, I mean, companies were more willing to pay it, or because they were, acquiring or procuring more sensitive data? They're just becoming better at their negotiations as part of the ransomware. Like, how
Perfect
does?
pricing, like that
Yeah,
kind of idea.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's so they chose to pay. So it's always been the bureau's position. I'm sure the Canadian authorities' positions as well is that they would highly encourage a company not to pay. But if you don't have a safe and secure backup, and you can't sustain your business if you don't have access to your data, you're really kind of in a difficult position, and many choose to pay. There is a process. There are some companies out there will negotiate with the bad actor in order to lower those payments, and that generally does occur in a lot of those instances. Whether or not you have cyber insurance or whether or not it allows for the payment of that is important. But it's also, depending upon the group, there could be some restrictions in terms of being able to pay, because there's something called the U.S. Department of Treasury has what they call an OFAC list, which is a sanctions list, meaning that if the entity is sanctioned, then it's illegal to be sending those funds to that group. So there's a due diligence process to make sure that where the monies are going, the crypto is going, at the end of the day, is not a sanctioned entity.
So you
So
can send money to kind of bad guys, just not really bad guys. Is that the premise?
yeah, that's in theory, that's the idea.
Interesting.
Yeah, but it's risky business to get into because there's so many variants of ransomware. So you may be paying for one group, but then another group will target you, later on.
I've got one. This is interesting. So I'm fortunate enough, I guess, to sit on our cybersecurity, or I'm trying to remember what it stands for. Anyway, their sort of executive team that goes through these tabletop exercises sort of semi-annually to brainstorm what we would do in the event of a cyber attack. Now, we're a lending institution, so often I think we're higher risk than a typical real estate participant, just because of the amount of money that kind of flows in and out and all the accounts. But we've had consultants, maybe not like yourself, Jim, that come in and kind of talk to us about these things. And the question came up being like, okay, so there's a ransom taken, they've got data, we decide we should pay or we want to pay, whatever the circumstances may be. Not to suggest that we want to or would, but what's the guarantee that they give you the data back and that they leave you alone? And how do you even know that you give this money and that you get the outcome that they say they're going to give you? And the response was, oh, no. Typically these bad actors, they're very polite in this sense, or they're very respectful, because they want the money and they want to know that you'll pay, and so they want the reputation of being fair and responsive, because if they have that positive reputation, the next time they do it, their reputation will precede themselves.
Like a handshake should mean something.
Yeah, and this, I'm gonna basically hold you ransom for tens or whatever millions of dollars. But don't worry, if you give it to me, I'll play nice and I'll give it back to you, because the next guy, I want to make sure that he knows that I'll do the same. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, 100% correct. Yeah, so they have help desks, and certainly polite, and will help. They could certainly want their ransom payment. And the other vulnerability you have is this double extortion scam, which is your data is encrypted, and if you choose not to pay the ransom, they still may have access to your data, and then they'll threaten you to they'll do something called doxing, which is exposing the information of your client customer information online. So there's a risk around that. To circle back to your previous question, where is the real estate industry at? They're probably in the lower. If you look at the sectors, they've not invested. They're typically not buyers of cyber insurance. Financial services are probably the most well positioned, because they're well funded, and their business is operated online. It really is. They're out of business, right?
Yeah, I mean, just not to keep going, but I think our CFO is something like 700 spams a day, right? Like it's absolutely insane the amount of sort of bad actors that are just trying to get in, right?
Yeah, heavily targeted, and but also a lot of great investments, tools. Leadership generally cares for sure what cybersecurity posture looks like
Probably
for a
the
bank.
perception of more to lose because we've got all the money coming through, but real estate companies, I think there's still a ton of risk for them.
There is, yeah, there's a ton of risk, but just they haven't really suffered the consequences yet. So which is why they, and it's a tough market, particularly with COVID, right? I mean, commercial real estate with more people working from home, so it's challenging. This is an easier said than done, so easier said to find the problem, much more challenging to figure out the solution. And in addition to real estate, hospitals in particular have been very, very vulnerable and aggressively targeted here in the States over the last couple of years, particularly because what does business interruption, like really when you have a ransomware attack or some other kind of event, what does business interruption look like for real estate? What does business interruption look like for a hospital or a bank? It's a different story. In hospitals, you have a potential loss of life. So that's really, if you're a bad actor, my ROI, my return on investment is best when I can cause the most amount of business interruption to the potential victim. So that's why you see hospitals being targeted. Banks, a lot of money, but they're better positioned, right? So they'll always get taxed just because of the revenue that the funds that can be stolen from there. But it's a tougher target.
What do you recommend people do? And maybe this relates to the idea of cyber business insurance as well. As I assume that if a policy is written, much like car insurance, the worse of a driver you are, the higher premium you pay. So what can you put in place to protect yourself, and what kind of obligations come along with an insurance like that?
Yeah, so Aon, where I work, is a large brokerage firm. 60,000 employees, located in 120 countries. We have I'm not even 100% sure how many cyber brokers, but it's probably 50 to 100 brokers across the U.S. who are really experts in understanding the kind of the risk, and the carriers, the insurance carriers that really put together. Aon puts the pack, what they call a cyber insurance tower, the insurance program together with various markets, and the markets really are the U.S., London, or Bermuda, and there are four major carriers, four of the large ones that really put a lot of really that underwrite a majority of the risk. But Aon, because we have a digital forensics incident response, we have a cybersecurity consulting practice, and we also have the brokerage practice. So we have great visibility in understanding the risks that our clients face, in the things that the carriers are most interested in ensuring, that the policyholder is doing before they put up the capital. And there are 12 areas. I can go through a few of them, but multi-factor authentication as an example is really important. You have your username and password to get into an environment, but another form factor of authenticating the individual is really important. Administrative controls and privileges. There's in any organization, they have end users, but the people who manage those systems, their credentials provide access theoretically throughout the entire network. So what are the tools that you're using to manage the people with sensitive credentials? And then training. There's 12 in total. But how you're training your workforce about cybersecurity, and that story that you tell annually to the various underwriters, whether your insurance tower or policy is $10 million or $300 million, is important. And that's the tools that you have in place, the backups you have in place, the visibility across your network, incident response plan. Have you tested it? Do you have one? So if something does bad happen, what are you going to do about it? So that's the program. That's what my firm
I can
is.
feel, Jim, while you've been speaking, Adam's realizing why he has to do spam training once every 3 weeks.
Oh yeah, it's like clockwork. Well, I mean, to that point, I guess the humans must be the weakest point in a security network. People like me not paying attention to a training session, clicking on a link I shouldn't. That must be the source of
$100 million deal. Just click here and it's yours. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. And nobody wants to be patient zero. That's kind of the expression, the term. Like if you're the first person to click on a malicious link or an attachment that leads to an infection in your computer, and then they just move laterally throughout the network, and then escalate their privileges, and then they start doing their work of gathering the kind of data that they want or spreading the ransomware across the network. And then when they're ready, they'll execute, and then
Yeah, what I found fascinating is that they'll sit there often for, I don't know, months and months, just kind of watching behaviors and collecting data. Like it's not a, what's the word? Sort of getting it out, right? It's very sort of purposeful, and they take their time.
yeah, it can be. Yeah, it depends on the objectives, right? So you have a nation state actor who's really interested in gathering intelligence, say against the Canadian government agency. Yeah, they could be very stealth and could be in your environment for quite some time. There's a group here in the States, IBM and Polyman, which is they do a study every year, and I think, or maybe the Verizon Data Breach Report, but regardless, it's one of those groups that does the report that it's called mean time to identification, in terms of how long was the bad actor on your environment before you knew it, and then mean time to containment. So, which is how long it took you to kick them off. The mean time to identification has generally been over 200 days for last 5 to 10 years. I mean, and mean time to containment has been 70 plus days. So that's just the mean. There's above and below that, but it can be very very fast. But generally speaking, it's a long time. It's a 6 to 9 month process of going through
Yeah,
that.
and in your opinion, is that just way too long? Do you think we can get that down? Like it seems like a really long time to me.
Yeah, there's an organization called MITRE, which is it's a nonprofit organization. It was started out at MIT, and they're a research organization, and they have something called the MITRE attack framework, which is really, if you look in terms of how these computer intrusions happen, there are various steps, various malware, various kinds of tools that a bad actor would use, from reconnaissance to exfil, right? And that's in this. There's a bunch of steps in there. And really the objective is what they call shifting left. Like if I can identify, the bad actor, through at the firewall point at the edge where, that I'm blocking those malicious emails that you're getting, right? If they get through, if I have network segmentation, I can prevent them from pivoting and going lateral. So the idea is early prevention, early intervention. No different than say healthcare or any other industry, right? The longer things go in your body or whatever, the more it can metastasize and become worse. So early intervention in cyber is the same concept. So the idea is really, again, shift left.
Our listenership kind of runs the gamut from young professionals all the way up to C-suite senior executives, and I think from our large multinational, multi-billion-dollar real estate investment funds, whatever pension or the other, all the way down to sort of the smaller private family size. If there are anybody listening that's going, geez, you know what, I need to probably take this more seriously. Like, what are the first steps? How would you suggest? Let's make an example just to make it easier. I own 10 buildings. I got a small office, 15, 20, 30 people, let's say, but I've not done any of these things. I basically have no insurance. Never really thought about it. Like, what do I do?
Well, I hope you call Aon. I hope you call us.
Okay, there you go.
Right. So, really, you got to start with an assessment. Really, there's, in our case, Aon has multiple cybersecurity assessments, and it's really assessing your environment. What does it look like? And we have ones that are self-attestation, meaning that you can just answer, several, dozens and dozens of questions about the various environment, the kinds of data you have, the regulatory industry that you're in, where your data is. Do you have on-premise solutions or cloud environment? Do you have endpoint products? Do you have a SOC that's monitoring these kinds of things? Do you have backups? All of those kinds of questions. So that's a self-attestation question there. And then there's more advanced ones where you get essentially at the end of the consulting engagement, which could be 2 to 3, 4 week process, you really get a roadmap in terms of how you can improve your cyber resiliency. And that's really what it's all about. It's, no organization is going to be perfect, and they'll all suffer some kind of, adverse cyber event. The question is, what's the consequences from that event and how quickly you can remediate it to really limit the amount of business interruption. So starts with that assessment and developing a kind of a roadmap over the several years in order to really improve.
What industries are getting it right in terms of cybersecurity? I mean, you mentioned that real estate lags, which is unfortunate, but if we were to look at another industry just at the top of the heap, who would that be?
Yes, financial services, without question, is certainly up there as top of top performers, even though they suffer events as well. Government and the U.S. government in particular, I can't speak to the Canadian government in terms of the protection they put in place, but government has done at least at the federal level, state and local levels can be more challenging just because of the financial resources, technical expertise. Energy sector is, certainly invested in it because it's so critical. I mean, if you think about it, that's the one industry sector that impacts everybody. If you don't have power to run your manufacturing plant, your real estate building, you have serious problems. So
And that'd be a terrorist risk in addition to financial.
yeah, certainly, yeah. I mean, the energy sector, all of these organizations have multiple risks, crime, terrorist organizations, cyber threats, so it's a little bit of a wild west.
In Aaron's example of his 20-person office, the 10 buildings, would it really just be criminal though? That would you be too concerned about hacktivists or anything like that? I mean, that wouldn't be on the radar, I imagine.
Yeah, primarily the two threats that would face the real estate community mostly, and I mean, 95% of the time, this would be the two types of things. One is a ransomware attack where it encrypts your systems and you're trying to, and you can't get back up and running unless you pay the ransom. And the second is something called BEC, which is business email compromise or a social engineering attack, in which they fool the finance department in the real estate company to wire funds to an entity that they thought it was legitimate, but when in fact it was not. And that's another $1 billion business annually, just by fooling companies, whether they get accesses to your systems and change account numbers, or whether they send a very well crafted email to the finance team pretending to be the CEO, like, hey, this is important payment, will lapse, and then and people do it, so they fool them. Typically, you'll see that when leadership is on traveling and hard to get a hold of, so they're smart, and that means they've been in your environment. They know how you transact. They know who you transact, so they understand before they launch that kind of social engineering attack. They know how to do it.
Thanks for the reminder, Jim. And this is, I think, if we're talking just to motivate anybody who thinks that they need to take this more seriously. We had a scenario about a year ago now. We're a transaction, right? So we were funding I think it was just a refinance. So we were sending money to a borrower, to our lawyer, to a borrower's lawyer, and then ultimately to the borrower's account. And we've been working on the funding process, the due diligence, the legal documents, et cetera, for 3 or 4 weeks. And at the day of funding, the morning of funding, we get an email. In fact, our lawyer gets an email saying, hey, by the way, we've changed our bank account. Here's the new bank account information. Please wire the money to this bank account. And I it's amazing to me that he saw this, but it was from, John Smith, and had John Smith's signature, and it was the same email chain that they've been going back and forth on. But instead of john.smith at, business.com, business was spelt differently. So it was john.smith with a slightly different email address, and I guess that he had caught it, and so they alerted it and obviously avoided that. But the bad actor had been sitting and watching the email correspondence going back and forth, just waiting for that perfect minute just to insert, here's the new banking information, wire the money here. And so that wasn't a huge transaction. It was, a few $1 million, wasn't a big borrower, and it was clearly just sort of a smaller time criminal, but looking just to score, $1 million.
Yeah, happens every day. And so the way to remediate that is really tighten up your security controls around, how you wire money, the authentication process. But in the event that you are a victim of that, first call has to be to your bank immediately and notify law enforcement. In the States, you really have about 48 hours because the funds, say the bad account that you sent them to, they're not going to sit there very long. They're going to be moved multiple times, and that's where if it goes past, goes past 48 hours, the likelihood of getting your funds back, it goes down significantly. If you get it within the first 24 hours, your chances are highly likely the bank will be able to freeze the assets. But after that, it's gone because it's going to end up most likely in China, and then the ability for the U.S. banks to seize those to get those funds back can be very difficult.
Well, how far afield does it need to go? Is it as soon as it leaves? If this is, Aaron's talking about a Canadian originated cybercrime here. As soon as it leaves the Canadian banking system, ready to luck. But if it got transferred to a friendly nation, can you get it back on its way to China?
Yeah, so that's the idea. Like you get it to the bank, you call the bank right away. Say it went from one of your Canadian banks to a U.S. bank to a UK bank, then to a Chinese bank. So the idea is notifying law enforcement can help those authorities. They call it the BEC kill chain, where you're trying to stop at any place you can. By getting law enforcement involved, particularly in the case in the States, the FBI or field office can call, say it went to a Canadian bank first. They can call the legal attaché in Canada, who can work with Canadian authorities because the U.S. government doesn't have any legal authorities in Canada or the UK. You have to work with those host country nations. So that's why this is really what I call a team sport. So notifying your bank is first, and then legal authorities after. So
I've got one more, Jim, and then we're running out of time. We're going to wrap up.
I got one more after you.
Okay, we got two more. This is another scenario that just occurred, and I'm curious your thoughts, or maybe this is just to reassure or reconfirm or re-encourage or anybody listening to take action. Another lending institution in Canada, a woman got an email saying, "Hey, we need to jump on a Teams call. I got to talk to you about this transaction." Gets on the Teams call. It's a colleague of hers and her boss on a Teams call. It's a short call about how instead of sending the money here, she's got to send the money there. Hangs up the call. She goes and she does it, and immediately she gets an email from her boss saying, "What the heck did you just do? Why did you do that?" And it was the AI digital Teams, and she was like, "Well, you just told me on a Teams call," and of course, it wasn't actually her boss. They had used
should have counted the number of fingers on the person,
or whatever, right? Like it was, she just so you can't even trust the Teams videos.
Yeah, I've heard of these deep fakes. I have not personally worked any of these kinds of cases. Certainly when in government, because the AI was not that advanced as it is now. But I've heard about these deep fake stories. So. I guess the outlier or the anomaly there has her manager kind of done that in the past? Meaning, like, is this the way that you would normally say to wire funds? So any of those
I doubt. Yeah, the answer is I'm sure not, but she took it on face value, no pun intended, right?
It's understandable. We're all human beings, right? Make mistakes.
Was AI going to benefit the good guys or the bad guys more over the next couple of years?
Is that your one question? You
No, that's not. No, that's follow up on yours, and I got one quick one.
Yeah, so in my view, it's going to help the good guys first for sure. And AI is a complicated space, and I'll just talk about kind of three particular areas as it relates to the topic that we're talking about, cyber. So there's a security aspect, there's a governance, and then there's an insurance aspect. So with and there's really kind of like three different forms of AI. You have your traditional, you have your advanced, and then you have this super intelligence, which is really about autonomous vehicles and those kinds of things. So as it relates to security, there really isn't a market for the bad guys to really mess with algorithms and things of that nature that companies are using. So really, most organizations are either trying to reduce cost, using AI to reduce costs or generate revenue. And for the bad actor, they're not really in the cost reduction business. So generating revenue, messing with algorithms and such, it just doesn't really make sense. And, so they'll use it right now for a better crafted email, maybe to enumerate the network a little bit to get a better visibility to launch their attacks. So early stages, not really active, but that will certainly change down the road. The second is really around the governance product area in terms of how companies really look at the development of AI, and there are really three types of people around the table for that. One are the data scientists who are building the models. The second are the security people to ensure those models are really safe and secure and not leading up to some bad consequences. And then the lawyers, really to ensure that there's not bias or some other kinds of risks that are being created from these tools. So the problem we're in that governance space is it's messy. It's not a mature industry right now, and over time it'll get better, but it's a really complicated space. And then the last is insurance, and really where cyber insurance policy. A lot of policies don't speak to the consequences of AI, whether it's a bias from say a hiring tool that you're using and it leads to bias and discriminatory nature against certain populations. So early days, I personally think the good guys are going to really get a head start and it'll be a much safer world. But it's always that kind of cat and mouse game, and so at some point it'll be more challenging down the road. But I'm more of an optimist when it comes to cybersecurity and AI.
Maybe we'll eventually win the chess game. So the last question I have for you might be a little cheeky, but this is a high-profile cyber crime FBI related story that came back to national prominence not long ago. I'm sure when I reference it, you'll know it, but for our listeners who might not be familiar, in the mid-2000s, a gentleman named Ross Ulbricht ran something called the Silk Road. It was a marketplace for criminal activity. It was kind of the spawning ground of cryptocurrency and the first users, I'm sure buying at $80 a Bitcoin, which would make people jealous today. And eventually the FBI had a very high profile arrest of this individual, a very difficult case. It made, big headlines at the time. And he got I don't know the sentence, a forever kind of sentence in the recent U.S. election. And don't worry, Jim, I won't ask you about the U.S. election because that's a highly volatile topic. But Trump promised that he would pardon Ross Ulbricht, that the idea being that running this marketplace is not the same as actually committing the crimes, that he does not deserve a life sentence. I guess the argument being that, if somebody uses a cell phone to make a call regarding a crime, is the cell phone carrier responsible? And I'm not advocating for this position, just kind of putting out there that the cell phone carrier should not be liable for that crime. So what's your view on that policy position that Ross Ulbricht would be pardoned for running the Silk Road? Because I know that was a big FBI win maybe 15 years ago.
Yes, I know some of the agents who worked on that case, and there was, the San Francisco office and the New York office. That New York office in particular was really the lead office on that case. So I personally wasn't involved in it, but I know some of the players. The president, Constitution allows the president to make these kinds of decisions if he chooses to do so. I personally, it's the marketplace that Ross Ulbricht created was pretty malicious. There was drugs and guns, and he's hiring hitmen to kill some of his adversaries and such. So the story about that marketplace is in the very early days of the dark web is pretty grotesque, and he's been in prison for many years. He was convicted and was sentenced accordingly. So what happens to him is there's nothing I can do about it, and but what he did was pretty evil, and it's only grown 100 times fold since then. There's multiple criminal forms similar to the Silk Road out there that you can get through anonymous browsers such as Tor. So it's a dangerous business, dangerous world out there.
Yeah, I thought I'd bring that up because it was very topical just a handful of weeks ago, and I wanted to get your take on it. And yeah, very interesting that you knew some of the people involved.
All right, we used up way more time than we planned on, Jim, but it was a very interesting conversation. You're clearly an expert, and thank you for taking the time and your patience with us as we kind of meander through all the different topping points. Thank you to Informa for introducing us to Jim as part of the Winnipeg Real Estate Forum. Of course, thanks to First National for powering the podcast, and thanks again, Jim. Great conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day.